welcome to Crime Time 911. Today's story is about somebody, a young woman who wanted to start her own business, be well known for this business, and of course, make lots of money. So that seems to be the dream of almost anybody if we could do that, right? Like if we could start our own business and make a lot of money, that's the ultimate goal at the end of the day, especially in this economy with, inflation and all the cost of living expenses just skyrocketing. This is the story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. Now, I'm not sure if I'm saying Theranos correctly. Elizabeth was born February 3rd, 1984 in Washington, D.C. She grew up in a family that was very well connected in business and to government figures. So her upbringing was already very connected, maybe even glamorous. So, of course, like anybody that grew up in that environment, they'd want to probably follow in their parents' footsteps and, make their own connections, make their own money and, make their own life as glamorous as it could be as they grow into adulthood. Elizabeth was always described as intensely driven, somebody who was obsessed with big ideas and innovation and wanted to do things that literally that changed the world. She wanted to be a world-changing inventor. So those were her goals from a very young age by the sounds of it. So that's a pretty big, goal for a child. Most children, when you ask them what they want to be, they choose things like the typical things like a doctor or a veterinarian or a teacher or, a nurse or something like that, right? They don't normally go to the extent of like, I want to be a world-changing inventor. So that right there shows you how different Elizabeth was as a child compared to other children. As a teenager, Elizabeth started to chase her dreams. She studied Mandarin and moved to China for a while, started a small business selling software to universities overseas. So that's quite an accomplishment for a teenager. I don't know of any teenagers personally that, started their own business other than maybe like a lawn care company or, snow shoveling or something like that, something very little. And even though that really isn't a business, it's more like they've created themselves a job. But to be a teenager, to learn a different language, travel to a different country and build a small business selling software to the universities overseas, that's insane. I couldn't even imagine doing that as an adult, to be honest. So eventually Elizabeth went on to be accepted at Stanford University into chemical engineering, which was a field that was largely dominated by men. But immediately she stood out among everybody in her class. During her time in Stanford, she was working in research labs, all that kind of stuff. And at just 19 years old, she filed her first patent application. So a patent is when you have an idea and you want to patent it so that if somebody tries to take that idea, they can't, or maybe you get some money out of it. I don't really know all the details of a patent. I just know that you have an idea, you want to patent it so that it sort of protects your idea in case somebody else thinks of it and tries to implement it as well. So at this point is when she started to seek out professors, people that could help her turn her ideas into actual reality. So she needed that help from her professors to be able to turn it into, here's my idea, my dream, but I want it into like a physical business product, whatever. She wants to make it happen. She wants to make it real. Professor Channing Robertson was one of Elizabeth's biggest supporters. Because Elizabeth had the backing or the endorsements of this professor, Channing Robertson, that gave her a lot of credibility alone because he was such a well-respected professor. So if he is vouching for this 19-year-old girl and saying that her ideas are amazing, that she could actually be going somewhere, this is great, obviously other people are going to be hey, we know that this guy is very well respected. He's not going to, reference somebody to us to help, endorse them or whatever, who isn't just as good or that he doesn't believe in. The thing that sparked the idea for Elizabeth was her fear of needles. She did not like needles. She did not like to, go to the hospital and get some blood work done. She didn't like that they had to take so many vials when you go in to do blood work. And I don't know, like I've done many blood works, with each of my pregnancies that I've had and for other reasons. And sometimes, yeah, they're like sitting there, like changing the vials when it feels like they've taken like, 10 vials of blood out of you, right? So I can understand that. Needles don't really bother me, so that's not that big of a deal for me personally, but I do know that there's a lot of people out there that do not like needles and, would probably do anything to avoid them. So this is where Elizabeth's idea was coming from, is that she wanted to invent something that you could take one little tiny pinprick of blood, so similar to like a diabetes sugar count reader. Sorry, I'm not sure what that is called, but how to test, how the people with diabetes, they prick their finger, a little bit of blood comes out, and then they test it on the little strip and tells them what their blood sugar is like or the glucose or whatever. So she had the idea of, if there was a way that you could take one little tiny drop of blood and put it into this machine and it could run like hundreds of blood tests that, currently we take, a few vials for to get all the tests done. So this was the thing that she wanted to do in order to not only just, alleviate the fear of needles for anybody who had that fear, but also make it a lot easier and also faster, I'm sure, for anybody working in a lab. That would be a lot less, work for them to do if they could just put it all in one machine and have that machine, run hundreds of tests and give them all these results. So at around the same time that she's trying to get endorsements for this new idea, that she has this new business, she drops out of Stanford at, again, just 19 years old, because she thought that she could revolutionize healthcare. And I mean, a machine that could take one little tiny drop of blood and, run hundreds of tests, then absolutely, that is revolutionary in my opinion. So Elizabeth went on to start pitching to investors. She pitched with a confidence that was beyond her years. People didn't see her as a 19-year-old because she, was so mature. She had so much confidence that she seemed like well beyond her years. She told her investors that she could build a device that would change the world. And they believed her because she was so convincing that they wanted to jump on board with this idea. And, who wouldn't? If you are pitched, if you have the money to endorse somebody or to invest in somebody into something that is world changing, you're for sure going to want to jump on that bandwagon, because if this works out, then you're going to be making money, tons of money, rolling in it, probably even more than what you have even now. So this was when Theranos was born. Now, to be clear, Theranos was just the business itself. So this isn't the machine yet. This is just the business that is going to make the machine, if you will. As mentioned before, because of Professor Robertson, Elizabeth had instant credibility with all of the investors. As mentioned before, with Professor Robertson's, support, an endorsement behind Elizabeth, this also helped to make the investors believe in her and to trust her, because otherwise, who's going to give potentially millions of dollars to a 19-year-old kid, basically, with just an idea? Like, yeah, maybe the idea was great. Maybe the idea had a lot of potential, but at 19, you don't have a lot of world experience. You don't have a lot of life experience. So it would probably cause people to be a little bit more hesitant. But because she had the support of a very well-respected professor, this basically gave the investors, gave them the idea that she must be really good if she's being supported by somebody that is so well-respected. So after this, she, started raising money. She started raising money for this business so that she could start building this device. These investors that Elizabeth was approaching were not the typical capital firms, because they would need technical proof that her idea was actually going to make them money and make their money back. So she targeted wealthy private investors. So they're not going to ask necessarily for the proof or for the technical proof. They're just going to be, listen to the pitch and potentially hand over some money. And that's exactly what they did. So she quickly received millions of dollars to start this business. So again, that's huge for a 19-year-old. I'm sure she was ecstatic. Like, if I had even half of that, I'd be ecstatic. So Elizabeth understood the power of image. So she ended up modeling her persona after Steve Jobs. So she, replicated Steve Jobs in, whatever way that she could as a female, in order to project the image that she wanted, the professional image, the image of trust me, the image that I'm going to be, somebody who changes the world. And the media went wild for her. They embraced it. They loved that, this young woman who was so brilliant was making a life-changing device, a world life-changing device. So Elizabeth went on to hire very talented scientists and engineers to build this device that she's been ranting and raving to all her investors about. So all of these people come together, they start working on the ideas, laying out the blueprints or however they do it. I don't really know. I'm not a scientist or an engineer, but they started seeing what they could do to build this device that Elizabeth is promising to everybody. And it wasn't very long before they realized that it really wasn't something that they could build. It wasn't something that was going to work in the way that Elizabeth was projecting it to work. So the machine or the device that Elizabeth has been ranting and raving to her investors about and the media, they called the Edison. So the scientists and the engineers realized that the Edison wasn't able to run hundreds of tests from one finger prick. It couldn't even run a very small handful of tests. So that was huge. So how are you going to sell an idea saying that this machine can run, hundreds of tests off of tiny, tiny little bit of blood? But in reality, it can't even run 5 tests, let's say, or 2 tests or whatever. It can't run tests at all, basically. So what does Elizabeth do? Instead of telling her investors this and, saying, I'm so sorry, the technology isn't quite ready for this yet, it's going to take more time, or whatever the case may be, she does the opposite, and she basically keeps leading them along, stringing them along, and telling them everything's okay. It's still in the works. We're testing, we're doing this, we're that, and the other, and basically pulling the wool over their eyes, telling them that, instead of saying that this machine is not going to work, at least not anytime soon, she's doing the complete opposite. So this is when she brings in Sunny Balwani, who is a former software executive, and he becomes her second in command. And in secret, they became lovers. So they were not just business partners or him being her second in command. They were secretly having an affair behind, closed doors. So I don't know if anybody actually ended up finding out that they were together, but at least in the beginning, they were keeping it secret from everybody so that they didn't know that these two were, more than just coworkers, basically. So together, Sunny and Elizabeth created a culture of fear, compartmentalization, and strict control on all of the scientists and all the engineers and all the other employees that worked within Theranos to make sure that they did not leak the secret that this device, the Edison, was not working out the way that they had all planned. They wanted to keep it completely secret. They wanted the investors to think that everything was just great, going along as it should be, no issues. So yeah, they literally, even in some cases, even threaten people, if you're going to be a whistleblower, basically, there's going to be consequences. They even went as far as aggressively having all their employees sign non-disclosure agreements so that they legally could not say anything. And anybody who questioned Elizabeth was treated as somebody who was disloyal, that they, the enemy, basically. So while all of this chaos and fear and, whatever else is going on inside Theranos, inside the business in secret, on the outside, Elizabeth is now going along and assembling a board of directors. So these directors were filled with powerful people and, powerful political people, military figures, that sort of thing. So she's assembling this board, again, telling them how wonderful this device is. It's going to be world changing, basically the whole pitch that she gave to all of her investors. And again, they believed her. It's also important to note that none of the people on the board had any scientific or medical experience. So they didn't know any better. They didn't have the experience enough to really think it through and to say, hey, wait a minute, is this really something that that one machine could do? Elizabeth is, pulling the wool over everybody's eyes on the outside, threatening everybody on the inside, and living off of millions of dollars, basically, because like if your machine internally isn't working properly, where's all this money going to? So I'm assuming she's probably spending it. The turning point came when Theranos secured a major partnership with Walgreens. Walgreens had invested heavily into Theranos, and they had plans to open centers across the United States that housed or that were specifically for this one device and all the tests that it was going to be able to run. So you may be wondering, why would Walgreens invest in something without proof? So what Elizabeth did, or Theranos did, probably obviously Sunny and Elizabeth had come up with this idea. They ended up taking blood from, volunteers or whoever, patients, wherever they got the blood from, and they ran it through regular blood testing tests, like the ones that have been going on forever. So they ran them through those in order to be able to give results to Walgreens to say, hey, this is what our machine can do. When behind the scenes, that machine didn't do anything at all. It was the current technology that everybody's using for blood tests that did it all. So by 2014, Theranos was valued at $1 billion. So she started off with just getting a few million. And now in 2014, she's in the $9 billion is her business. And literally it's built on nothing. The device doesn't work, and she's made $9 billion, or her company is worth $9 billion, and she hasn't even produced anything yet. That's still so crazy. And why are these investors not asking, why are these investors not asking for proof? Why are these investors not, wanting to see the device? That's what I would want to see. I would want to see the device. I would want to see it working if I, invested in something like that. In 2014, not only was Theranos, worth $9 billion, Elizabeth was celebrated as the youngest female self-billionaire. I have no words. This is just so, I've covered a lot of, fraudulent stories and stuff like that, and I still get baffled about stuff like that. I don't know why. Eventually, a small group of employees became deeply concerned about the potential risks that Theranos was putting patients into, because they had witnessed firsthand how Theranos was using traditional lab machines, not the Edison, not this new machine that they have been claiming to have, and then pretending, obviously, that the results came from the Edison. So, but not only that, but data was being manipulated to hide failures, as well as patients were receiving incorrect medical information. That's huge right there. Patients cannot receive incorrect medical information, whether you're telling somebody who's perfectly healthy that they have this serious condition, or worse, the other way around. That's insane. I don't know how anybody could in good conscience be able to do that. You're literally holding people's lives in your hands. So what would have happened if one of these patients had passed because of the result of this? They could have been charged with, some sort of first, second, third degree manslaughter, whatever. They could have been charged for that, right? So of course, this small group of employees tried to raise their concerns internally, and like everybody else, they were pushed away, threatened, whatever. No concerns at all internally. So that's when, in 2015, they started to reach out to people on the outside. This is when investigative reporter John Carrio, and again, I apologize if I haven't said that last name correctly, received a tip that Theranos technology wasn't working. But at first, he didn't really realize how big the story was or would be. He just, probably thought, oh, well, okay, maybe let me dig into this a bit and see what happens. But as he dug deeper and dug deeper and dug deeper, he realized how much information was here and how big the problem actually was. So as he dug deeper, and uncovered some more shocking truths to the story, John had decided to interview former employees, medical experts, and lab insiders that used to work in Theranos so that he could get more information as to what exactly was happening on the inside. Because again, the secrecy was very, very tight. They didn't want they didn't want the truth getting out, because how else are they going to be making billions of dollars if people realize that the technology they've been promising for years upon years now isn't actually being made, basically. Through months of investigation, John uncovered the sick truth. He uncovered that Theranos was not using their own machines, but not only that, they had modified standard medical machines in order to make them fit into their criteria, as well as they diluted samples. Like, how do you dilute a sample? Like, why? I don't understand this. So in October of 2015, the Wall Street Journal had published John's bombshell article. So Theranos was finally exposed to everything that they were doing over the years, all the lies, all the intimidation, all the diluted samples, all the, modified existing machines, and that the Edison really wasn't running any tests at all, despite what Elizabeth and Sonny were telling everybody. So after this, the federal agency started huge investigations. Walgreens ended their partnership. Investors started suing. Board members distanced themselves. Nobody wanted to be a part of Theranos anymore. And obviously, rightfully so, people who had invested millions upon millions of dollars into this company, they wanted their money back. Which, of course, if you're not getting the product that you were promised after investing so much of your own money into it, of course you're going to want your money back. So by 2018, Theranos was completely dissolved. Nothing left. It was worth nothing at that point once everything was exposed. And Elizabeth and Sonny were charged with multiple counts of fraud. So in 2021, Elizabeth's trial had started. It became one of the most watched white-collar cases in modern history. So everybody was tuning into this because they just couldn't believe what was going on. The jurors heard testimony from former employees, lab directors, medical experts, all the people that basically were involved, the investors, and how the lies and the manipulation had affected them. The jurors also even heard from patients, the patients that were affected and received incorrect results. So they heard it all. There was no secrets. The prosecution said that Elizabeth was fully aware of everything, that she knew that the Edison wasn't working, that all the tests were not run through the Edison, that, other machines were modified, that samples were diluted, all the things. Like they said that she was fully aware of everything happening on the inside. However, the defense would say, no, that's not what happened. It was all Sonny, like that Elizabeth believed in the mission and that it was misled by Sonny. So instead of, taking responsibility, she was blaming somebody else. But, she started the lies just before Sonny came in. I think Sonny had a big part of influencing her in the beginning, but I'm sure eventually, she could have decided like, hey, wait a minute, this has gone too far. But no, she kept playing along. So I don't think it's fair that she's trying to put all the blame on somebody else when she's just as guilty. Maybe these were Sonny's ideas initially, but she didn't have to go along with it. So Elizabeth even was so bold to take the stand. She took the stand so that she could tell people that she had no intentions of deceiving anybody. Okay, you have no intentions of deceiving anybody, but yet you've done it for years. So sorry, I don't buy it. The jury didn't buy it either. They found her guilty on 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And she was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. So that's good. I'm glad to hear that she was in there for a while, because I was, as I was researching this story, I was worried that the end result would be like she spent a year in prison or something stupid like that, because I've heard of big cases where they've only served like 6 months to a year, maybe even 3 years, but 11 years, I don't know that it's enough especially for the patients that were affected by this. But I have to say that at least it's better than, a small amount. So not only was she sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, she was also sentenced to 3 years of supervised release, and she has to pay $452 million in restitution, which was jointly with Sunny. So between her and Sunny, they both have to pay back $452 million. Hopefully they still have that in funds somewhere, because otherwise you're screwed. Elizabeth has continued to appeal, and the courts are basically saying, no, we're not even amusing you with this idea. Like, no, you serve your sentence. You did the crime, you do the time. You know how that saying goes. So in 2022, that's when Sunny's trial had started. So unlike Elizabeth, Sunny chose not to take the stand. So I feel like that's if you can't admit that you were at fault, then it's probably better just shut up and not pretend to, say that you didn't know what you were doing, you didn't intend to hurt anybody and all that BS. Like, it's better to just stay silent, I think, instead of, spewing out a bunch of stuff that people just aren't going to believe you for anyways. If anything, that's going to make you look worse. So the prosecution presented extensive evidence showing that Sunny oversaw the labs, managed day-to-day operations, helped enforce the culture of secrecy and intimidation, knew the technology didn't work, helped to mislead investors and partners. He was found guilty on 12 counts, including defrauding investors, defrauding patients, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and he was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. So he got a few more years than Elizabeth, which again, I don't agree with. I think that they should have at least had equal sentences, but whatever. And then, as mentioned before, he has to pay the restitution of $452 million jointly with Elizabeth. So that is the case of Elizabeth and Theranos, and how they manipulated a bunch of very, very smart people into investing millions and billions of dollars into a company that literally had no product. What do you think about this case? Please leave your opinions in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss another episode. Thank you for watching Crime Time 911. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember to always trust your gut.